On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the numbers are in for China's economic growth. What's the forecast for the rest of the year? And the European Parliament votes for the next leaders of the EU. Will their selection determine Europe's direction? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We begin with a look at China's economic performance in the first half of this year. Official data shows GDP growth came in at about 6.3%. That number is within the target range of 6 and 6.5% the central government set for the whole year. Let's take a look.
Halfway through 2019, and it's time to let numbers do the talking. China's 6.3% GDP growth reassured many, though the second quarter performed less well compared to the first. Performance of manufacturing is encouraging. Total value added of industrial enterprises saw an annual growth of 6%. In terms of trade, though facing pressure from conflict with the U.S., China maintained a year-on-year growth of 3.9%. That outpaced the figure from the first quarter. Income levels in the first half rose by 6.5%, higher than the overall economic growth rate, and the income gap between rural and urban residents narrowed. The biggest contributor to the robust growth is consumption. China's per capita consumption spending came in at over 10,000 yuan in the first half of 2019. That's an increase of 5.2% after taking out price factors. Particularly, rural growth has outpaced urban growth, continuing a trend from last year. China reports that the economy has performed within a reasonable range while moving steadily towards its goal of high-quality development.
The economy has sustained the momentum of progress in overall stability. However, we should also be aware that the economic conditions are still severe both at home and abroad. The global economic growth is slowing down. The imbalanced and inadequate development at home is still acute.
Though shouldering downward pressure, China's economy has shown resilience. China has again shortened negative list, removing multiple limits for industries including shipping, infrastructuring, culture and telecommunications. This further demonstrates China's continued opening up policies.
So what do the numbers tell us? In Hong Kong, we invited Hong Hao, the managing director and head of research at Bocom International. In Washington, D.C., Ralph Winnie, the director of the China program at the Eurasian Business Coalition. Last but not least, in Beijing, He Wei-wen, a senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with you, Mr. Hong. How would you read the number? Obviously, the number has been going down in terms of the GDP growth rate. From about 7% to 6.8, and now this year 6 to 6.5. Now we are seeing the first half 6.3. The second quarter compared to the first quarter also down. How should we understand this trend, Mr. Hong?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about the 0.1% difference between the actual number and the expectation. And also, most reports focusing on this number being one of the lowest in 20 years. But you can see the rate of deceleration of economic growth is actually slowing down. So we are, even though we're slower in this quarter, but then, from last year's rapid deceleration, there is a moderation of deceleration of growth as well. And also, if you look within the numbers, you're seeing strength in consumption and also better than expected investment growth as well. So I would say I will use those strengths as a leading indicator for economic growth going forward.
I see. But what about for you, Mr. He? Do you think this number going apparently down worrisome to you, Mr. He?
It's not too much to worry about, because we shouldn't pay too much attention to the number changes behind the decimals. We see if we just cut it half, 3.4, 3.3, 3.2 or 3.1, no change, no practical change. So still it's above 6%, it's okay. And there are temporary reasons, especially we saw a downturn in April and May, but in June we saw a rebound So I just wonder whether it would continue in the third quarter.
I see. Mr. Winnie, from your perspective, obviously there's something called the China-U.S. trade conflict going on over there. How much do you think this number surprising or not surprising to you?
I'm not too surprised. I think consumption has continued to play a major role in driving economic growth, with final consumption contributing to 60% of economic expansion from January to June. But certainly the U.S. imposing tariffs of $250 billion on Chinese imports and having drawn retaliatory sanctions from Beijing on $110 billion in U.S. products certainly makes the Chinese economy certainly very problematic. I do think it's important, though, to mention that J.P. Morgan Chase has just stated they're going to raise their stock market forecast because they're seeing the likelihood of a U.S.-China trade deal as being rather imminent. And I think that's a very good sign for both the U.S. and Chinese economies moving forward.
Well, you've been using the word problematic. Is it problematic, Mr. Hong? It seems that your American counterpart has certainly very different opinions from yours.
Yeah, I would say that the new information in this set of numbers is really the number in June. For the month of June, we're actually seeing a pickup on investment growth, a pickup in consumption, and also a stabilization of overall growth rate as well. So, from that perspective, I wouldn't be too worried about this set of number. But having said that, though, if you we do have one of the slowest quarter in 20 years, and so I think that some people may pay attention to that.
I guess impression is one thing. What is even more important, Mr. He, is actually where does this number come from in a way? Mr. He, if you look at the trade numbers, the net exports have been going down, whether it's import or export. What does it say to us, Mr. He?
Well, if we put it in dollar terms instead of renminbi, we see that export actually stood still, no growth, zero growth, and import was down by 4%. That's not good. And
what does that mean if it is going down 4%? Even?
4%, because we saw that it's in absolute terms value, it's almost $40 billion short of the same period of last year. About half, or $20 billion, were from the United States, from the United States. Imports from the U.S. It counted 50% of the the imports. While exports, for the first half of this year, China's exports, according to China's customs, fell by $17.6 billion. But China's export to EU, ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, China's Taiwan, Hong Kong combined added $17.6 billion.
So it's almost equal, it balanced out.
Imbalance.
Yeah. So what does that mean, Mr. Winnie? It seems that the U.S. Will still be very relevant for the Chinese economy, or that relevancy is going down as we speak?
Well, I think it will depend on China's ability to have access to other markets besides the U.S. But certainly I do think a viable U.S.-China trade deal will be a boon for both the U.S. and Chinese markets. I think it's only a matter of time before the governments of both U.S. and China really sit down and hammer out a really viable trade deal that's going to be beneficial and it's going to ensure a cross-border flow of trade and investment opportunities. That'll be a win-win for both countries.
Today, of course.
I do think, though.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. No, I do think that the European Union, their markets have suffered, and if China is able to take advantage and to really penetrate and create viable trade agreements with the Europeans, I think that will put a little pressure on the U.S. market for sure.
So, Mr. Hong, it seems that whether the U.S. economy is that relevant to China or not, it's actually up to the two governments to be able to hammer it out if there's a deal. Of course, the time is not in just China's hands, but also in the U.S. hands. So it seems that when it comes to general economy, one has to not think too much of the trade conflict. But Mr. Hong, China has been talking about doing its own things well. If to try to develop its economy well, what does it take? For example, now, will China be able to put out the so-called large stimulus package as it did years ago? Would that be a good idea?
I think it's actually a good idea right now. I think, when the economic cycle is slowing down, it actually needs the government stimulus, either physically or monetary policy, to stimulate the economic cycle to get it back on track. So I think, when one look at the numbers, one probably have to focus on the leading indicators, which is the money and credit growth. I would say that broad money M2 growth is actually better than expected, and also there are money that is coming out of the credit growth system. The special purpose bond issuance, which amounts to close to 400 billion yuan, which is very strong, and they are going to be applied to infrastructure spending. So I would say that I would look at those numbers rather than the coincidental or lagging indicators that we just discussed.
Whether you believe that is the case also, Mr. He, a stimulus package, even large one, is that a good idea?
No, I don't think so. We had experienced 10 years ago during the global financial crisis. In the year 2009, we went forward with a large stimulus package, which with fixed investment contributed 8.0 percentage point to GDP growth that year. But we see that over the past 10 years, the fixed capital investment increased again and again. But for the first half of this year, it contributed only by 1.2 percentage point to total GDP growth. It's diminishing. So we should think about the sustainability of the investment package.
Obviously, there are already very different ideas coming from our two Chinese panelists when it comes to the economic growth and what should be done. Mr. Hong, respond, please, to Mr. He's comments.
Yeah, I would say that if you want a sustainable policy, you want to get your investment return better than your financing cost. So at the moment, just now, Dr. He mentioned that in 2009 we put out a very large amount of infrastructure spending, and I think at that point in time it's actually critical to get our economy out of a very deep sort of a recession period. So I think right now, even though the growth rate in China is slowing down, as you can see, GDP growth is about 6 and a bit percent, plus 2% inflation. So we're still getting about 9% investment return, and our financing cost is about 5 to 6%. So we're still getting positive investment return beyond financing costs. So I would say that even at this point in time, laying out more investment to help our economy is not a bad idea.
Mr. He, I have to, just to be fair, give you also a fair share of time for you to respond to that. Really investing into infrastructure once again, Mr. He?
Yes, I quite agree with Mr. Hong that we should think about the feasibility, the returns of the investment. So we should target the actual right projects for investment which can bring returns.
What in your eyes are the right projects?
First, we say if we step out investment in the high tech, in the big data, and artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth, and also in the high tech manufacturing, which has been growing pretty fast. Also, as regards to infrastructure, I still think that the transportation is still good because it is a longer term for returns.
Well, Mr. Winnie, you've been listening to your two Chinese colleagues tentatively. Your thoughts here, particularly about the investment, where to go and how much to go, infrastructure vis-a-vis high tech and innovation. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that's certainly the way to go. High tech, AI, as a way to continue to stimulate growth and investment. I also think that as China moves towards more domestic consumption, creating areas and the opportunities of tourism and leisure development is going to be key. to encourage Chinese people to spend money and to travel, take vacations. And this is an area that's created tremendous amount of growth already within mainland China and also overseas. So the great aspect of China is that the government is so willing to be able to engage directly with business and to promote job creation. So that's a real strong advantage to creating a stable economy. So we'll just see how that goes moving forward.
But on the other hand, Mr. Hong, today, Mr. Hong, we also hear that the news, Huawei, for example, is closing down its American branch, American office, about 900 people likely to have their jobs elsewhere. So many wonder, when China is investing into innovation, when Chinese companies, technological companies are expanding around the world, will this phenomenon also be repeated for other companies, whether it's in U.S. or elsewhere? And what does that mean for China's future development strategy of innovation and technological advancement, Mr. Hong? Well, what does that mean eventually for the Chinese economy, of course?
Yeah, I think it's a little difficult to speculate what individual firms would do, in this kind of environment, because the trade negotiation is still ongoing, and also the relationship, the dynamics between U.S. and China seems to be shifting. So I think, when company management plan out future capex and R&D investment, they probably will have to take that into account. So I wouldn't be too surprised to see, companies relocate some of their R&D efforts somewhere else. And also, given that, there's sort of a technological rivalry between the U.S. and China, and at the same time, China is getting technology imports from Europe and also from some Asian countries such as Japan and South Korea. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, relocation of efforts go into those regions.
Mr. Winnie, your take, since you're based in Washington, D.C. right now.
Correct. Yes, I do see other markets opening up for China, especially South Korea, Japan, and increased access to the European markets. I do think, as I said before, a viable U.S.-China trade deal is going to open up more opportunities in the United States. I do think Huawei, ZTE, those are all issues that are on the table between the U.S. and Chinese governments to ensure that those companies have access to U.S. market share. But I do think it's going to take a little time,
Well, a little time. We'll see how much time that will really take, because the economies around the world are all waiting for the result of the China-U.S. negotiation.
Right.
Talking about the economies around the world, from January to June this year, the Chinese economy grew to more than 45 trillion yuan, or about 6.56 trillion U.S. dollars. In comparison, based on IMF data, $6.5 trillion is roughly a third of the United States full-year GDP in 2018. It's comparable to the combined full-year GDP of Japan and Canada. It's not that far behind the combined 2018 GDP of Europe's two biggest economies, Germany and Britain. And we are saying all of this. It's not trying to say, well, China's economy growth rate going down is not a big problem, but rather to show what is the size of the other's economy. Having said that, though, Mr. Hong, I have to ask you about that, particularly about the U.S. economy, as the Fed chairman was in a hearing last week talking about the Fed rate cuts. So it's very likely, some say, reading from between the words, that the U.S. would do exactly that a few weeks from now. What do you think that would mean for the Chinese economy? Of course, the PBOC, Chinese Central Bank, immediately said it's still going to maintain its prudent monetary policy. But to you, what kind of message is it?
Yeah, I think the Fed is going to cut, and I think it's built into the market consensus right now. Once the Fed starts to cut, it opens up room for monetary easing for the PBOC as well. For monetary policy to be prudent, one has to compare benchmark interest rate relative to inflation, underlying inflation. And I think globally the underlying inflation is weakish. I think in the US it's less than 2%. I think in China we've seen the peak of CPI for this year, even though some volatile items such as fruit, energy prices still going up, and also because of the pig flu there is some pork inflation as well. But overall, we're not seeing sustainable inflation pressure. So once the Fed start to cut, then I think PBOC would cut as well.
Interesting. Mr. He, your take here, particularly recently analysts have been indicating that the U.S. does have space to do the rate cut. However, not that much as we see 2 to 3 years time. What do you say? What does that mean to the Chinese economy?
First of all, I should say that this is not the right time for Fed to cut rate, because Fed should be still in the process of raising interest rates. Because if they do not raise the basic rate enough, they will not have adequate tools to offset the next recession. But now they just cut the rate too early. So
but
there's a
now
big
they're
problem.
having a great time if you look at the American economic numbers.
No, it's a number. You should read between the words. Because for Q1 of this year, the GDP growth was 3.1%, but the fundamentals, the personal consumption expenditure and the fixed investment combined contributed only 1.1 percentage points, half the rate of the last quarter of last year. This weakening. So in the case of China, because the weakening of outside the world also affects China's external environment for China's economy. So I think I quite agree with Mr. Hong that PBOC will be considering about the easing monetary policy.
Well, another round of easing monetary policy around the world started from the Fed. Mr. Winnie, your take here, the messages you are hearing in Washington, what does that mean for the general atmosphere of economic prospects? Shall I put it that way?
Well, the Trump administration has been putting a lot of pressure on the Feds to cut these interest rates to spur economic growth within the U.S. And as you know, he's going to be running for re-election, and the key to his re-election is a viable U.S. economy. So it increases the pressure to ensure that the economy is in good stead. I do think home ownership in the U.S., the growth of home ownership is going to be key. The growth of the manufacturing sector, the high tech, is going to play an important role as well. And what Trump would like to see is more foreign direct investment coming in from China. They signed a memo of understanding with China Energy Investment Corp, where they would put $250 billion in the U.S. to help us stimulate economic growth. And we have to see if that will come to fruition. But again, this all goes back to a viable U.S.-Chinese trade deal that, if signed effectively, will be a boon for both economies. There's no question in my mind about that.
There are so many things going on with all of the election cycles and also the China-U.S. trade negotiations, as well as how vulnerable are the economies elsewhere in the world and their impacts on the overall economy, on the two largest economies, such as that of the United States and China. For now, I want to thank the three of you, gentlemen, for helping us to understand your perspective about the Chinese economy with the latest numbers. Hong Hao, Ralph Winnie, and He Wei-wen. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. Coming up in the program, the European Parliament votes for the next leaders of the EU. Will their selection determine Europe's direction? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei from Beijing. Now turning to the latest on the EU's top job prospects. Almost 2 weeks ago, EU leaders finally agreed on the presidents of the EU's main institutions. These decisions reflect a host of considerations, such as political affiliation, geography, and even gender, of course. Now it is time for the European Parliament to vote. Will the nominations get approved? Let's find out.
The second plenary session of the European Parliament will be held from July 15th to the 18th. The European Parliament is going to vote on the nominations for the main leaders of the European Union. Germany's female defense minister, Ursula von der Leyen, was nominated as the president of the EU's powerful executive arm, the European Commission. Another lady, current head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, was nominated as the president of the European Central Bank. Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Borrell was proposed as the EU foreign policy chief. These three key posts were nominated on July 2nd after the EU leaders' 3 days of deliberation. On the same day, they also elected Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel as the president of the European Council, which together with the European Parliament are the legislatures of the European Union. On July 3rd, Italian socialist David Maria Sassoli was elected president of the European Parliament. The focus of this Parliament meeting is voting for the post of President of the European Commission. If confirmed by the European Parliament, Ms. von der Leyen would be the first woman to take on the Commission presidency, with responsibilities including proposing new EU laws, enforcing the bloc's rules, and handling trade deals.
So who are likely to be the leaders of the European Union? In Brussels, Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. In Rome, we invite Valerio Bordonaro, who is a political expert and also advisor to the former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta. And in Beijing, finally not least, Cui Hongjian, director of the Department of European Studies, China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Cameron, of course, you've experienced this moment many times. This time, the names are already there, likely to have final approval?
I think so. It's a package deal, as you said in the introduction, and I think the parties recognise that if they did not approve the deal tomorrow, it would be opening a Pandora's box. They would have to sort of reassess the whole situation, and that's not what is required at the time. So I think it will be relatively tight. I don't think she will get more than 400 votes, but I think she will be approved tomorrow.
Italian, German, and also French are certainly represented as the names indicated. Mr. Bordonaro, though, some of those names are actually coming out not necessarily through procedures recognized by all parties, but they seem to be also winning hearts. What do you mean, and how do you see this phenomenon, particularly regarding the European Commission?
Well, you see, it's, as usual, a package that is negotiated among the people in the Council, and the results of the election is not taken so much into consideration. There's no representative of the Greens in the majority, but yes, it's again a negotiation on that. And yeah, the names are part of the deal, and was supposed to be also, you see, the Spanish socialists are represented too. Yeah. It's a big negotiation. Unfortunately, it's a council negotiation.
Mr. Cui, of course, we all understand whether the European Council and the European Parliament, what kind of role it will exactly play on the final decisions of the European Union and some of the most important political capitals. It's always a big question mark. However, these leaders are likely to lead the European Union through the next few years of possibly very turbulent times, as we're seeing geopolitics changing so much, and the fate of EU is on the horizon. Mr. Cui, is there some common characteristics you're reading among these names?
Indeed, we can find out this very, very special, change of the European institution, especially for its leadership. Also, in the past, obviously, the bigger powers, major member states, they prefer to stay on the back stage. But this time, it's very special. You can name that France, Germany, Italy, they try to stand on the so-called center of the stage. So I think that shows maybe a requirement from European integration. Now it's time for these major member states and the big powers to play a more active role. So of course, maybe there will be some other by effect, because once there are more, domination or more power by major member states, perhaps there will be some more negative response from these small and the medium and the middle-sized, member states.
Interesting. But Mr. Cameron, something are very important right now. That is, we see some differences in opinions between France and Germany. We also been seeing German Chancellor Angela Merkel, obviously believed to be a very strong leader inside the European Union and certainly on the European continent, have been suffering from some kinds of unnamed health problems, to say the least, over the past 1 year or two. And also we've seen the Brexit tendency coming from the UK. Some of the economies in Europe are not necessarily doing very well at this point. So how constructively do you think these names will collectively play? Is that a big question mark to you, Mr. Cameron?
Well, I think it's a good balance that the European Council have brought together. I mean, the problems that you have mentioned have been around for some time, and it's up to the new team to try and inject sort of new energy into the EU, try and connect better with citizens, try and meet some of the
Cameron,
demands,
the question is really, what about them?
Change.
What qualities about them that you believe they're likely to do a better job than the previous ones, besides gender balance?
Well, Ursula von der Leyen has been a member of Angela Merkel's cabinet for 15 years. She sat in at all the top decisions. She has traveled the world. She has a huge international network. Josep Borrell is a very experienced Spanish foreign minister, previous president of the European Parliament. Christine Lagarde needs no explanation. And Charles Michel has obviously been a very good chairman in terms of Belgian politics, and we saw the skills that Herman van Rompuy brought to the first president of the European Council. So, as I say, I think this team together has the necessary skills to ensure that they can steer Europe through all the difficult items that you mentioned.
Mr. Baldonado, it seems that there has to be very strong European leadership because the relevancy of Europe is really on the line right now. How much do you think they will be able to encourage and stimulate the kind of energy within the European Union despite of the difficulties that I mentioned earlier in the earlier question?
Well, I think they're going to do a good job. As was said previously, the team is well balanced and experienced to do this, and the fact that France and Germany are really backing this 5 members of the top jobs, it gives very, very interesting signals for the future. The point is to understand what is going to happen in the Council with the Eastern European countries. They're not represented at all, and they are more and more Eurosceptics. So that's going to be the biggest question mark on the result of this new Commission and European top-level jobs.
Mr. Cameron, there is always some kinds of sequence, possibly, as they say, when the European leaders are coming into the office after the election and this time of the approval. How long a period of time would you like to give to them about their agenda, about their tendency of policies, about their way of bringing consensus within the European Union, and about their choices or choice to be made about transatlantic relationship with China, and also how they're likely to take the approach about the European Union issues relating particularly Brexit?
Well, they have 3 months before they take office, so during that time they'll be meeting with political groups in the Parliament, meeting with member states, and they will be setting out their agenda. I'm sure there'll be a number of meetings together, and they will be putting forward their own platform. It won't be radically different from what we have just now, but it will be tackling, I think, some of the big issues like climate change, like economic growth, like migration. These will continue to be priorities. But I think the balanced team will perhaps bring new skills, new leadership qualities that we haven't seen before.
Mr. Cui, of course, this year is a big year. We all know that reform of the WTO, it is also being heatedly discussed. And of course, the European Union has a big role over there on this topic and beyond. What about the geopolitical issues? What about the trade issues? What about the financial issues? And what about the economies inside Europe? These are all questions very relevant, I guess, the leaders have to answer, even though they're not necessarily representing specifically every government, but certainly the European Union.
Yes, as we understand it now, European Union is facing a very complicated environment, not only outside, also inside.
Sure.
I think now, yeah, I agree with the guests from Europe mentioned that yes, it's maybe consequences of balance. But I am doubting about how about this efficiency from this kind of balance of power. Because it's easy for us to neglect those names, von der Leyen or some other. We always remember the name of the country, I mean Germany and France. But of course, so far, I think that now the most important thing is this
efficiency.
This new, yes, efficiency, and another very big priority for this new team is they should keep the stability and also this consistency of policy. For example, for China-EU relations, we have a lot of, joint statement and common grounds for the, former administration. But now, how about this? Yes, there's some change from Mr. Ronk to maybe Madam von der Leyen, but I don't hope that there will be some difference from Luxembourg and Germany.
Well, we'll ask our European expert to see what they think about that. Mr. Baldonado, for national government, particularly political parties, there's always big changes, but the European Union, as Mr. Cameron earlier illustrated, there should not be that much a change, but maybe in style. But who knows at the time of political change? What do you say, Mr. Baldonado? Efficiency issue, sustainable issue?
Well, I'd say that if the leadership, and with leadership I mean the Parliament, the Commission, the Council, and the Member States, they all acknowledge that the world is shifting from geopolitics to connectivity, and the main things are trade, investment, joint programs about sustainability, the joint research programs. In a multipolar scenario, all the issues are going to be solved. The point is that how much national issues are going to be taken into consideration instead of the European and the world issues.
What do you think then, since you asked that fascinating question?
Is it to me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think that we have several countries in which the European stands are not taken into consideration at all, or at least not enough. Italy is one of those at the moment. But I think that the European leadership is going to be strong enough to push a little bit the Eurosceptic countries and the Eurosceptic governments to focus on this new line. But it's very important. It's not, about names or countries. It's more about changing the point of view about the world. I think the new leadership could do that.
Interesting to talk about Italy, Mr. Cameron. We understand that Italy is one of the very first G7 countries to work with China to develop the third place market and also on the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, that has been receiving mixed reactions coming from its European Union counterparts. But the question really is, should the European Unions all come to consensus, or whether different capitals should have their own choices, particularly at a time of great change? Consensus is one thing, individual choices is another thing. Efficiency vis-a-vis innovative approach, these are all questions involving the EU for a long, long time, Mr. Cameron.
Well, the answer is it's going to be a bit of both. It always has been, always will be. There are, of course, elements of a common policy towards China, which all the member states signed up to just a few months ago, talking about China being a strategic partner, but also in some areas a systemic rival. So that was something everyone agreed on. At the same time, it's well known that all the 27 have their own relations with China, and as you said, Italy signed up a MOU on the Belt and Road, with other major countries did not. So I don't think that's going to change, but I think overall there's going to be a recognition that a more united European approach is necessary to deal not only with China, but with the United States and with Russia as well.
I see. Mr. Cui, final words from you, very briefly, please.
I think now for European Union, it's time to be familiar with some new reality situation, not only in China and also in European countries. I think that the European Union is also one of the consequences of diversity, combination of diversity. So how could make a balance between the combination, cooperation, coordination, and the diversity? I think it also will reflect its policy towards China.
Very interesting discussion, gentlemen. Thank you so much for all your input. I'm sure when the leadership coming into the office, there's more to discuss about. For now, thank you so much, Fraser Cameron, Valerio Bordonaro, and Cui Hongjian. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.